Despite the fact that all 5 Teen Titans are these incredibly likable characters, it's not at all difficult to figure out why the most common favorite has always been Raven. Even throughout the first 3 seasons, where characters like Robin or Tara are given the spotlight, whatever episode or scene the show would give to Raven would always have this feeling that the other members of the team just couldn't produce. This hard to describe darkness that was always accompanied by this defiance to do good anyway. And given just how interesting this feeling is, even in standalone episodes, it's not at all shocking that when it came time to design what was, at the time, the final planned season of the series, that they decided to give the character the focus she had always deserved. And that's what I want to explore today. In this video, we're going to go through Raven's struggle with her father to overcome her evil destiny, and discuss how, through some of the most fascinating decisions that the series ever made, Teen Titans both made Raven's focus feel like nothing else the show had ever done, and the culmination of everything the series stood for.
No matter where you go, no matter how you squirm, there is nothing you can do to stop it.
Despite the title cards you just saw, we actually have a different episode to talk about before getting into the season, as we take a little trip together all the way back to the beginning of the show with episode 6, Nevermore. And despite the solid amount of early series jank that this one possesses, it's not exactly surprising that this first Raven-focused episode of the show is also the first fan favorite of the show, with some really fun writing and visuals just about guaranteeing it. But despite all of that, what's most important about this episode relative to this video is the big bad at the core of it, the visual representation of Raven's anger, who the credits confirm is indeed Trigon. Now, fast forward 3 seasons to the story arc we're talking about today, the characters got a new design and a new voice, being introduced to the audience and the other Titans as if we've never seen them before. As I mentioned a second ago, unless you make the argument that it was Trigon's presence genuinely manifesting itself within Raven's mind, then the character in this season is not actually the same guy from Nevermore. But the way they treat him here and the lack of recognition from Beast Boy and Cyborg make it feel more like the show is just choosing to not let their old story affect their new one. A decision that's pretty hard to disagree with. All in all, it's just a footnote that, while definitely interesting to go back to, never actually comes close to having an impact on how much I enjoy the season. Moving on, despite just how much I've really loved some of these season-long story arcs that the show has had before this point, it's hard to argue against the fact that each of them tend to start a little bit slow. Both Final Exam and Divide and Conquer are a bit too focused on being solid pilots. Tara's namesake and introduction episode drags its foot quite a bit when it comes to getting to the actually interesting themes, and, well, Cyborg's whole arc is just kind of a snooze. Even though the first 3 seasons of the show have some genuinely mind-bogglingly cool stuff when it comes to these multi-episode stories, it just simply takes them a bit to really build up to it, making it a pretty safe bet that Birthmark would do something similar here. It does not. Seriously though, to just generalize the tone of this episode, I'm genuinely not sure that any of the other 64 half hours hold a candle to just how truly bonkers these 22 minutes are. To start off though, we actually get this fight against Dr. Light that's, not surprisingly, super fun to watch. This cold open may only clock in at a little over 2 minutes, but what I think I find most interesting about it is how they blend together the typical Titan style with the darker atmosphere, something you'll only hear me mention a shit ton throughout the rest of this video. Don't get me wrong, there are still definitely some classic Titan style bits here, with Beast Boy and Starfire especially being a delight, but the real identifying factor of this one is just how it looks. I mean, there are just very few moments, especially cold opens, in the show with this visual style. One that sets up what the rest of this season arc has to offer pretty damn well. Also, this fight contains the biggest, and arguably only, reference here that we do actually get to Nevermore, with Dr. Light clearly still remembering his Season 1 confrontation with Raven. Overall, this cold open is just this really enjoyable setup, and one that's sure to— wait, was that Slade? Seriously though, even before the intro begins, we get some pretty big indicators of what's to come, with both the return of the show's most iconic villain, as well as the first inkling towards what exactly Raven is so anxious about, neither of which taking terribly long to come back into the episode. As we cut back to our seasonal heroine, who's busy sitting in the dark and counting down the minutes until the end of the day, we get the first example of something that the rest of the episodes in the story will be littered with, which is the contrast between the moody Raven and the cheery disposition of the rest of her team. Obviously, this dynamic has been used for countless jokes in the previous 3 seasons, but I think the horror atmosphere surrounding Raven's walk through the tower being interrupted by her friends blindly celebrating her birthday is the first time where the show isn't doing it entirely for laughs. Sure, there definitely is some inherent comedic value to Raven freaking out over a birthday cake, but the tone pretty quickly shifts towards something entirely different, with the context around her birth pretty quickly pointing an arrow towards why. In general, with perhaps an exception in the form of the group's leader, the rest of the non-Raven Teen Titans will more or less act as a unit relative to her story in this season, with Star, Beast Boy, and Cyborg pretty much playing the same role. I'm not at all trying to say that this is a bad thing, by the way, as the last thing this season needs is more things to give screen time to, but anyway, I think this first becomes quite clear within this scene, as they all become representative of the idea that Raven's friends all desperately want to help, and she simply won't let them get close enough to do so. To get to the other Titan though, Robin, while definitely also filling that role with the rest of the team, does end up being the closest thing to a confidant that Raven gets here, something I think works really well with their pre-established dynamic. This first begins to develop in the following scene, with a really neat little reference to Haunted tucked in here, but in general, throughout the story, Robin will be the Titan that actually interacts with Raven. And is this decision probably at least partially born out of the show wanting to give Robin a big role in perhaps the final season of the show? Almost certainly. Does that at all stop me from really enjoying how they portray the relationship between these two characters? Certainly not. In the following scene, and I promise I won't go scene to scene forever, but the beginning of this episode is just too jam-packed not to, but it's here where we get the first real glimpse into what Raven, the Titan that's been pretty consistently portrayed as the team's strongest, is so terrified of, and it definitely lives up to the hype. Despite the fact that Trigon won't actually show up for another hour or so, his presence is so immediately portrayed in a way that so clearly represents the power that he holds, with his warning to Raven here being so visually imposing. The idea to have Raven physically struggling to breathe here to match the suffocating feeling of this prophecy weighing down on her allows the audience a bit more understanding into the emotional side of the conflict, even before we really know what this conflict even is. Just watching this character that's done these incredible things on screen become completely powerless against a being that's not even physically present is pretty impactful to the viewer, allowing the subsequent return of Slade to almost get to hit for a second time. Speaking of which, holy shit do they handle his return so unbelievably well. Just the orange and black factory setting does so much to set this up, but it's really this entire scene that's so damn good. To start with the section pre-time freeze, I think the way they write each of the Titans here does a fantastic job in setting the tone for this entire encounter. Each of these Titans throughout the entire show have demonstrated an obviously developed lack of response to some pretty crazy stuff. I mean, when you see the things they see every single episode, you likely become pretty numb to it, but that doesn't stop them from becoming abjectly terrified by the return of the man that they watched perish. even besides just the shock of it happening, there's also the Terra piece that Beast Boy pretty quickly mentions. The pain of learning that your friend's big sacrifice ultimately didn't even take out her tormentor. Terra may be gone, but the man that pushed her to the edge is still around. Outside of the actual character interactions though, the final pre-fight thing worth mentioning here is how they set up the reveal of Slade's new abilities. See, throughout all of his previous encounters with the Titans, Slade has always avoided a full 1 versus 5 fight, except for the one time that he couldn't, where things notably went south pretty quickly. While the villain had always been portrayed as plenty powerful, easily able to best Robin, it's always been clear that he's not exactly going to win a fair fight against the Titans, setting up, in this moment, some type of reveal. In some way or another, the audience expects Slade to have some type of new firepower, but likely not the type of firepower that he actually has. And while this video is not about Slade, and you can hear my thoughts about his character in pretty much every Titans video I make, I just can't talk about this episode without discussing how kick-ass his portrayal is here. From arguably the best performance Ron Perlman ever gives the series, to the show fully embracing him being evil Robin, one-liners and all, it's just a ridiculously fantastic use of a character that they had already gotten plenty of fantastic uses out of. However, while the idea of this character being the same guy who did all of those terrible things to Robin and Terra is neat and all, ultimately the role of Slade here, and especially in the following episode, is to represent the fears of Raven, and I think it's safe to say that he does that pretty damn well too. Some of these lines are just ridiculously chilling, so much so that I'm very confident I chose one for the title card of this section. Anyway, this fight is obviously great, but it really is the stuff in the back half of this episode, after time is frozen by Raven in a last-ditch effort to avoid her future, that ultimately ends up being the most memorable. Anyway, speaking of time being frozen, it's time for the third atmosphere mention of this episode, as the blues of a jump city suspended in time, especially when contrasted against the peak at the city's future at the end of the episode, just works so well to fully reveal just how gigantic Raven's predicament is. Her struggle isn't just going to affect her or those around her. Raven's destiny is to destroy the world. As I touched on before, outside of their small initial interaction, this part of the episode ends up being where the show chooses to really use Robin for the first time, and I think it might be here where it perhaps makes the most sense. Don't get me wrong, there will be Robin and Raven moments throughout this season that I'll praise relentlessly, but a lot of those could have probably also worked with really any other character. But here, in this battle against the Boy Wonder's most personal antagonist, this story only works with these two characters. As you've already heard me talk about for like an hour if you saw my video on the pair, but Robin and Slade are responsible for a litany of the best fights in the show. I mean, even in the season where one of them is dead, they still provide an episode with some nauseatingly terrific action. But that's not what you get here. Raven's struggle is so gigantic, so grand, so important, that the fights that once seemed like the end of the world aren't even fights anymore. The new Slade and whoever sent him just doesn't have time for things as simple as Robin. After this moment, we get the most clarity towards what's actually going on that we'll really get until the end of the following episode, as even if at the time it's a bit hard to tell what parts of Slade's speech are metaphorical, with the reveal of course being that really none of it is, his and Raven's explanations do paint a pretty clear picture. I especially love how they place the Titans reveal of this in this beautiful church setting, but either way, the idea here is that Raven's birth came with a prophecy that, on whatever nondescript birthday this is, something would happen and destroy the world around her. And besides just coming with perhaps the hardest line of this arc, as Raven tells Robin that not having a party doesn't mean it's not your birthday, it's here where the thematic elements of the story first begin to really seep in, the first of which being the dangers of denial. While Raven certainly didn't fully just ignore what was coming, she seemingly told nobody about it, and really didn't have a single piece of a plan to give her a chance to circumvent it. It's not so much that Raven had just accepted that this terrible thing was going to happen to her, it's more so that she had already accepted her lack of input into whether or not it did, a mindset that ultimately set the state with Slade. Speaking of which, after Robin is separated from her once again, and a short but fun chase scene through Jump City later, we finally reach the climax of this episode. A climax that somehow manages to top everything that came before. As Raven's costume continues to get ripped up, symbolizing her true self literally getting more and more exposed, Slade finally does what he's been threatening to do this entire episode, delivering the message of what Raven's new world is going to look like, and it's nothing short of hellish. Just the imagery here is superb, with the Titan statues especially being terrifying, but nothing can compare to just how vulnerable and how weak our protagonist is portrayed as feeling here. This is a character that has typically donned a literal cloak and is now being forced, with her autonomy being ripped away by a man she hates, to view the planet she loves in flames, all while being told that it's going to be her fault. It's this scene that forces the viewer, in between trying to find the perfect screenshot for their desktop, to not only view Raven in an entirely new light, but also reconsider what the show is willing to do to one of the good guys. And while this episode won't end with a complete bad ending, as that's a fate generally reserved for part 1s in this show, it's still definitely not a happy place to leave our characters. And I don't just mean not in a happy place in the sense that this episode is clearly set up for worse events in the future. I mean not so happy place in the sense that Raven doesn't really figure anything out here. She went into this episode with a broken mindset towards this prophecy that's haunted her since the day of her birth, and that mindset hasn't been changed at all. To explain what I mean, after Raven's effectively tortured by Slade, ultimately violated as much as this show was ever going to get away with, she simply tries to pretend that none of it happened, cutting her hair back to what it was at the beginning of the day and covering back up the symbols that had been appearing across her body. Even when Robin comes to her with one of my favorite moments of his outside of a Robin episode, apologizing for letting the prophecy come to pass and failing his teammate, she feels no need to explain what's going on. She now knows for sure that this horrible thing is on its way, and she knows that her team is going to go crazy trying to figure it out, but she just can't bring herself to let others see into her less than fortunate past, especially after Slade just forced his way into it. Even the seemingly nice part of this finale has a depressing undertone, as while Raven is allowing her friends to celebrate her birthday, it seems like it's more so just to placate them rather than actually accepting that the circumstances surrounding her birth aren't actually her fault. In conclusion, if you couldn't tell by the fact that we're like 15 minutes into this one and I haven't stopped talking about it yet, Birthmark is a special episode. One that has so much to say, and so many interesting ways to say it. Just 22 minutes of chaotic excellence, both completing a really stellar singular experience, and setting up the rest of this arc as well as it conceivably could.
I'm not afraid of you anymore.
You might not fear me, but look who's afraid of you.
In comparison to the episode that preceded it, the prophecy is a bit disjointed. That's not to say that I think this episode is bad or anything, as I'd argue that the highs of this one are equal to anything that the rest of the season produced, but I do think they spend a bit too much time here on stuff that's harder to care about. Anyway, before I get too far ahead of myself, the general setup here is that the non-Raven Titans are trying to figure out what's going on, and Raven is trying to solve it without their involvement. We even get a paradigm of this before the intro, as Robin tries to figure out the symbol on the new Slade, and Raven has visions that slowly spell out who exactly the big bad is. And while I don't hate the idea behind this plot, I do think there's a good chunk of it that feels uniquely frustrating when compared to the rest of this season. For starters, and I'm sure that somebody could probably come up with a reason for this, but I genuinely don't understand anything that Slade or Trigon does in this episode. Throughout this one, the goal of Slade is to get Raven to tell her friends about the prophecy. And while I do understand how this works in the sense that it allows the audience to learn alongside the Titans, I really can't come up with a solid reason why Trigon, a god who believes his plan to be inevitable, would go through the effort to make sure that some random mortals knew what was coming. I think my best guess would be that the real purpose of this is to make Raven have to verbalize her role in what's to come, but I'm pretty sure this plot is mostly just set up in order to get to the 2 or 3 scenes they need to hit before the finale. Anyway, after another Slade fight, the only interesting part of which being his discussion with Robin that I already touched on in my video about the pair, the plot fully splits, as Raven heads home and her friends basically just do less funny Scooby-Doo. To give a bit more of a serious glimpse into that latter part, while I do find some of the stuff with the ghost chanting or whatever to be a little interesting, it's really just a lot of nothing that seemingly exists just to cut into whenever we're not focusing on Raven. I mean, I'll be the last person to complain about just some fun Titan shenanigans, but watching them just descend a staircase for several minutes before remembering that half of them can fly, only to get to see Raven for literally less than 20 seconds before we're back to the gang goofing off with ghosts, it's a bit hard to not get a bit bored. Anyway, speaking of Raven, while it is a little difficult to fully enjoy it in the form in which it's presented, with approximately 400 cuts in this 3-minute scene, there really is a lot to love here, despite the show being, again, a little too coy with explaining what's actually going on. For example, I'm not sure there will really ever be answers to some things in this episode, like why was Trigon trying to stop Raven from going to Azarath, and was her discussion with her mother real in any sense, but nevertheless, even the small things that are easy to complain about can't quite manage to ruin just how interesting this whole scene is. Raven walking through the barren yet heavily atmospheric town, finding Arella and finally admitting that she's scared of what to come, only for her vulnerability to be rewarded with confirmation of her worst fear. That Trigon truly can't be stopped, and that Earth wasn't the first place he wanted to destroy. The cut to an Azarath in ruin is one that really shouldn't be that hard to see coming, especially with just how off the entirety of the planet already feels. But I think the episode does a really good job of allowing it to hit as hard as it needs to, mostly by focusing on Raven's perspective. Sure, I understand if you find Trigon or Arella to be these interesting characters, but the truth is that this entire arc is about Raven, and it's her response to learning that her home that she admits she somewhat abandoned, was no longer there. That's what makes this moment justify the entirety of the messy 19 minutes beforehand. However, I'd still argue that the following scene is even better. There are many words you could use to describe what occurs next, as Raven ruthlessly attacks Slade in a way that the show has never really seen, ripping him from the ground as he attempts to retreat and continuing to thrash him for no real purpose, but I think there's 2 words that immediately come to mind: cathartic and bittersweet. To start with the obvious, seeing Slade get the shit beat out of him is inherently more than enjoyable, and there's never a single moment here where the show insinuates that he somehow doesn't deserve every bit of it. But it definitely implies that none of this is actually beneficial. Slade didn't do what Raven is so upset about, and even if he did, it's unclear how much what she's actually doing is hurting him. At the end of this thrashing, he just gets up and continues on with his day, seemingly unbothered by what just occurred. something that definitely doesn't apply to the rest of the Titans. Truth be told, after this scene, and for reasons that make sense, the show will completely drop the angle of Raven's friends being scared of her, as them harboring any of that feeling completely ruins what the end of this episode is going to go for, but even that doesn't fully take away from just how affecting this frame is. Raven just learned that her entire culture has been decimated, leaving the Titans as the only form of family that she has left, only to come back to her friends seemingly thinking she's a monster. The same type of monster that she just learned took everything from her. Getting to that ending though, while Raven just explaining her situation is a bit bland, there are some really neat touches here, like the idea that everybody around her already knows who Trigon is. I really think there was a very good chance that the show could have chosen to make Trigon this entirely new entity to every non-Raven Titan, but giving him the in-universe notoriety to avoid this ultimately makes this scene hit that much harder. And while the ending may be a bit much with the sun rapidly rising or whatever, I don't ultimately think it's worth complaining about, as the show is definitely not new to slightly corny friend stuff right before the credits. In general, as you could likely tell by the way I've been talking about it, this episode ends up being slightly less perfect than its predecessor. And while you could make an argument that some of this comes from the fact that it's a half hour focused on a twist that I've known to be true for literally a decade before writing this video, I think some of the pacing and general plot decisions made in this one are just somewhat objectively questionable. Still, and a lot of this does come from those terrific two scenes right at the very end, but this episode ultimately had a single goal: set up the 3-part season finale. And it's pretty hard to argue that they didn't do a damn good job.
I love sunrise. The promise of a new day. Anything's possible.
You always so cheery this early?
Pretty much.
Going into part 1 of the season finale, it's not hard to guess what outcome we're headed towards. Just like the first section of every season finale that's come before in this series, this episode is all about getting our team to a place that seems impossible to come back from, just so they could do exactly that in the following episodes. But even with this conclusion set in stone from the very beginning, it's the way we arrive there that I find absolutely fascinating about these 22 minutes. I know this is a weird place to start, but the first thing I want to talk about is actually the sound design of this one, as it feels quite indicative of the general tone here. See, throughout the first half of the episode, the plot will follow Raven trying to hide the incoming end of the world by being uncharacteristically cheery, a situation that obviously sets up some goofy scenes, but I think it's the music choices here that really sell just how eerie this whole day feels for everybody taking part in it. For most of this first half, the episode's soundtrack just feels like a more amped up version of what it normally feels like, banging drums and electric guitars filling the air as we get a fairly typical fight against Plasmus. But every once in a while, the music just changes. Guitars swapped out for eerie sounding synths, reminding the audience that this fight isn't what the episode is about. This fight isn't what today is about. This effect is obviously a bit subdued in the latter half when everybody is aware of what's going on, but I still find the way they combine the rocking backing tracks of a showdown with Slade with the inevitability of global destruction to be a really interesting through line in this one. To stay on topic with the presentation, the visuals here are also just quite top-notch. From the opening bit on Titan's Tower to the things they do with the monochrome magic stuff towards the end, this episode is just filled to the brim with visuals that look as nice as anything this series has ever had to offer. To actually get into the events of this episode, I actually am going to split up discussion by character, starting with Robin and by extension the rest of the non-Raven Titans. And while throughout the first half of this one, they mostly just seem a bit too oblivious to what's clearly going on around them, the second half has some really interesting things to say about the group, largely relating to just how indifferent they are to Raven seemingly just giving up. Even with the person closest to the events of the end of the world saying that it's hopeless, and even as their big final attack against Slade does little to nothing, there's just never a moment here where the rest of the team seems a tiny bit resigned to the fact that maybe there just is nothing they can do. Of course, this does come with a bit of sappy "we are all your friends" stuff, but it's still largely this really kick-ass final stand from Robin and the gang that ultimately doesn't matter in the slightest. Speaking of not mattering in the slightest, this episode features an extension of Slade's appearance back in the Prophecy, as his facade about being the right-hand man of Trigon continues to rapidly crumble. Even before Raven takes control of his army from him and his powers are stripped at the first sign of insubordination, this already feels like the first time in the series that Slade is being portrayed as something besides a big threat. While in his previous 2 episodes it was pretty clear that Slade was working for somebody else, he still felt more mercenary than servant, something that just never quite feels like the case here. Finally, and especially given the fact that she's practically absent for half of the season finale, Part 1 arguably features most of the Raven will get for the remainder of this arc, and it luckily also contains some of the best stuff they ever get out of the character. And while the first half of the episode, with her trying to give her friends a good final day, is sweet and all, it's really the dialogue and performance of the latter half that truly qualifies that statement, with the dread of the character just jumping out of the screen. She's constantly talking about the power of her father and the certainty of the prophecy, the idea that if there ever even was a battle, it was over as soon as she was born. Even as her friends continue to blow through every sign of inevitability, begging her to fight back, she still refuses, deciding that any effort to try and stop the end of all things she loves just isn't worth it. Some of the dialogue here is just heartbreaking too, with the character admitting that all the good she ever did doesn't even begin to outweigh the evil she's about to take part in. The realization that her entire purpose was to decimate the planet she calls home just seems to have destroyed Raven, and left her a husk of her previously somewhat hopeful self. But that's not actually what's happening here. See, while a few shots of the penny from Beast Boy are really the only signs of such within this episode, we later learn that Raven spends the entirety of the first part of the season finale trying to concoct a plan to give her friends a chance at resistance, paralleling Trigon's relationship with Slade by imbuing a bit of her power within her friends. And while it is something that recontextualizes much of this episode in a slightly less interesting way, turning much of Raven's acceptance into mere attempted deception, I do think this allows Raven to remain a much more effective protagonist, as there's not much less main character-y than just giving up and accepting the end of the world. Overall, this first part does a ton of really interesting things, both in its presentation and in its direction, but the end result is still the same. Much as Trigon taking over the Earth was inevitable, so was the fact that the first part of this finale would end with such. Moving on, while there are several signs here that this arc was originally meant to be the last that we ever saw of the Teen Titans, I'm not sure that any are as clear as the format of this second part, where throughout 99% of the middle third of Raven's big story, she's just not here. And while there are certainly allusions to her thematic arc, with this whole episode pretty much being about how important relying on your friends is, I still kind of find this to pretty easily be the weakest of the 3 parts. There are a few other reasons for this too, with the writing here being some of the show's goofiest, with this moment where everybody gets all emotional about Robin's big sacrifice to go with Slade instead of with the rest of his team on their suicide mission easily being the biggest offender of such, but the biggest reason we're going to somewhat breeze through this one is because Raven just isn't very present, at least until the big reveal of her survival as a little kid at the very end. Also, while there is still one really sick part of this episode, with the final real chapter of Slade and Robin's dynamic that ultimately becomes one of my favorite moments of the entire show, It's both not really related to what this video is about, and I kind of talked about it extensively in my video on the pair earlier this year, so we're just gonna kind of skip it too. Anyway, enough about things I'm not gonna talk about, let's focus on what I am gonna talk about, starting with the opening reveal that Raven did indeed give part of her powers to her friends in an attempt to give them a chance at stopping Trigon. As I mentioned before, while this does somewhat diminish her actions in the last part, I do really like the decision to take the character in this direction. There's always been this hope within Raven's darkness from the very beginning of the show, and illustrating how, even in the darkest moment, it was still present is a really nice touch. Another thing I really love about these opening moments is actually a continuation of a trend I haven't really mentioned yet, which is just how well they reutilize environments in this arc. This isn't out of laziness either, with the backgrounds almost always being entirely visually different, but realizing just how much of this arc takes place near Titan's Tower or the library or the skyscraper from Birthmark just makes this whole story feel interconnected in this really neat way. Speaking of Titan's Tower, that's where Trigon will remain for the next 30 minutes, as he struggles to remain an interesting character outside of his daughter. Sure, I understand the appeal of having our team face the epitome of evil, but especially when you take away the context of his relationship to Raven, Trigon is just a pitifully boring villain at times. Anyway, after Trigon shuts down the Titans' attempts to end this arc early, and while Slade and Robin are delivering perhaps the most fan-servicey scenes ever animated, and I mean that in the best way possible, the most prevalent story of this episode features Starfire, Cyborg, and Beast Boy fighting evil versions of themselves, and oh boy is it a mixed bag. To start with the positives, I do really like some of the angles they take with this. Referencing Blackfire, Terra, or Cyborg's history all adds depth that helps this feel more finale-y, and some of the action here is really stellar. Especially in the duel between Beast Boys, where stuff like the elephant-mouse interaction is just creatively goofy in the best ways, there's just a ton of really neat choreography here that prevents these scenes from ever getting too boring. On the other hand though, this fight takes a long time to wrap up, even dragging into the next episode, and they never manage to take the writing into an exceptionally interesting direction. Sure, I understand that the point is supposed to be that only through friendship can you work through your personal problems, and sure, that's a nice way to utilize these characters while Robin and Raven are doing interesting stuff or whatever, but that theme only works if these evil versions of the characters are actually reflections of their quote-unquote dark sides like the show claims they are, and they're just not. In short, these characters behave significantly more like they're supposed to be opposites rather than being personifications of our Titans' less ideal behaviors. It would have been really interesting to see elements like Cyborg's irritability or Starfire's inability to fully control her emotions be brought to life here. Hell, it would have even been a nice callback to Nevermore, but instead they take the easy route, where all these characters just act the same and are just generally cruel. I really am generally more fond of the fighting the dark version of yourself trope than I think the average person is, especially in an action show like this where the choreography just becomes so inherently fun. But I really don't think there was a less interesting way to do this story than the way they do it here. Anyway, ending part 2 on that super fun note, let's go ahead and roll into the final 22 minutes of this arc, which I promise I'll be a bit more positive on than the previous 22. Speaking of which, the first piece we get here is actually the end of the whole Cyborg, Starfire, Beast Boy versus evil versions of themselves thing I talked about before, where they all learn the value of leaning on others and the lack of importance their universe places on power scaling, but I actually found something else to be the most interesting thing here, which is how they choose to use the ending of the story to hype up Trigon. Besides just being big and hilariously using the tower as a throne, the titular villain of this video hasn't really been doing much throughout a good chunk of this finale, right until they hit us with the reveal that he's been entirely aware of everything going on and just doesn't seem to care. Of course, in retrospect, this is really more indicative of the hubris that will get him wiped off his own planet in about 15 minutes. But in this moment, it makes him feel like this truly undefeatable villain. There's no secret plans capable of defeating him, no tricks or deception. Trigon isn't just the representation of true evil, he's the representation of inevitable evil. The show does a few more neat things with him too before the final showdown, including the shots of him approaching our crew, which truly show his staggering height, but we'll get back to all of that in a second. First though, we gotta talk about the Slade stuff in this episode, which is perhaps the only thing they ever do with a character that I feel pretty meh about. In this show, there are two different perfect send-offs for the villain, with the last episode giving us the iconic temporary team-up with his biggest foe, and Things Change giving us this indescribably chilling reminder of what the character represents. And in between them, this episode gives us a showdown with a random evil guy. I almost think the episode expects you to be rooting for Slade here. Like the idea that this random demon dude is somehow worse than the guy we just saw mentally break Tara down to the point of begging for death, but it just doesn't work. Sure, this Slade scene may be sick, but does it have even a trace of thematic relevance? Not really. Thematic relevance, however, is the main driving force of the final plot of this episode, and the return of this arc's main character. And while I do think I probably would have made her present more in teen form throughout this episode, so it feels a bit less like Robin talking down to our seasonal protagonist, their conversation here is still mind-meltingly excellent. To quickly summarize it, and I'll have quotes on screen here to kind of emphasize this, but the scene essentially goes as follows. Robin tells Raven about all the good things she does. She says that none of it matters because she was always going to let Trigon through the portal eventually. He says that that doesn't matter because it already happened. It's kind of a weird exchange on its face, and it is one that is ultimately somewhat let down by the Deus Ex Machina ending of Raven overcoming her daddy issues and magically being big and powerful again, but it's also the only part of this episode, in conjunction with the ending, that I truly find fascinating to talk about. In short, this kind of thematic revelation that the episode spells out for the audience here is exactly the same kind of thing that the entire series has been about. One of the weirdest things that this show does, and they do kind of break this in the literal next episode, but we'll just pretend that isn't true, but generally, the show is very light on giving us the backstory of these characters. Sure, we get peaks, like we do at Raven's Azarath upbringing in this arc, but the show is never terribly interested in how our characters got to this point. Hell, the show never even actually tells us how some of these guys got their powers, or what most of their real names are. According to Teen Titans, what happened to them in the past isn't nearly as important as what these characters do next, and that's what Robin tells Raven here. He re-emphasizes this back on the surface too. Now that our character has escaped her personal hell, as illustrated by Robin literally dragging her out of it, it's up to her what the next chapter of her story entails. Raven was never able to control her true destiny, and it's almost certain that she was doomed to become Trigon's portal pretty much no matter what. She was dealt a bad hand, and there was nothing she could do about it. Nothing but decide what move she was going to make next. As I mentioned before, I'm slightly less concerned with the inner workings of this episode. I'm sure that somebody has a really good explanation of why Raven becomes a teen again in this exact moment, or how she suddenly has the power to defeat this god even in his weakened state, but that doesn't really matter. Again, I'll point to the ending scene here that I think just does a truly transcendent job at transforming the thematic junk I just talked about into this wonderful final emotional moment. Once the big bad is gone and the world is saved, Raven and Robin have a final conversation about hope, and how, even if she doesn't know it, Raven has always been the most hopeful Titan. A character deemed at birth to end the world who spent her entire life trying to save it. A character born from hate who works to stop it anyway. A character destined for evil who dares to be good despite it. Sure, Raven was always going to bring the apocalypse, but despite the title of the episode, it didn't have to bring the end. There's always going to be a happily ever after for Raven, but only if she continues to chase it. Unlike what was originally planned, this isn't the last we see of the Teen Titans. But even if I am more up on season 5 than pretty much anybody else, with episodes like Lightspeed Go and Things Change being more than worth continuing the show, it's hard to argue against how perfect of an ending this would have been. If the entirety of Teen Titans is about the importance of trying to make the world a better place despite the circumstances, and I believe it is, then there just isn't a better example of that than Raven. So while I think my heart may lie a bit more with other parts of this show, something I probably didn't make very subtle through my discussion of the past couple of episodes, I do genuinely want to commend this season 4 arc for what it does. Juxtaposing tonally but concluding thematically, one of my favorite things I've ever gotten to watch. Anyway, that's about it for me. Thank you so much for anybody who waited this long for this video. The final few months have been nothing short of a disaster for trying to get videos out, so the fact that you're hearing this now brings me more joy than you can possibly imagine. Somewhat ironically, given the subject matter, this video was initially meant to be somewhat of a final bow on this era of my Teen Titans coverage, as I was planning on taking another break from the show, but I think I might just have one more little addition to this trilogy for next year. Either way though, this has been AmpleSamuel, and my voice is entirely gone. Thanks for watching.